We came this close to probably ending the truth embargo on ET reality. The goal of PRG was for the media to finally put so much pressure on it that they had to break. Donald Trump is without question the most dangerous person to ever sit in the Oval Office. No president in history even comes close. She had the connection, and her presidency would have led to disclosure. One can sort of read about it, but no one really knows the full story. We came this close to probably ending the truth embargo on ET reality. And the reason is that there was a connection between the leading presidential candidate in the 2016 election and the extraterrestrial issue. This connection goes back 23 years. There was an attempt to bring this connection into play in Senator Clinton's effort to run for the presidency in 2008, but it didn't catch. The media did not bite down. But the second time around, the media did engage, and this set the stage for what could have been disclosure, either under President Obama or under a President Clinton. What happened here? The short version of this very long story is that her husband, President Clinton, was engaged by Lawrence Rockefeller in 1993. Rockefeller wanted Clinton to release all the files, UFO files, and grant amnesty to witnesses that might come forward. This would have effectively ended the truth embargo. Rockefeller was a friend of the Clintons, a big donor to the Democratic National Committee, and a billionaire, and a Rockefeller. So it's not easy to say no. And so this effort began and started in March of 1993, and it went on for 3 years. And the upshot is that whatever attempt President Clinton might have made to get files or get cooperation, he would have gotten nothing. As Jimmy Carter, President Carter, nothing. Why? Well, the reason is this. The extraterrestrial reality and the government's engagement of it is the highest classified issue in the military intelligence complex. The government has known about the extraterrestrial presence since the 1940s, and they embargoed it. They classified it. They took it completely black. No one should be shocked at that. Where it remained for the next 44 years during the Cold War. And the Cold War was full justification for those within the military intelligence community to continue to keep the extraterrestrial issue embargoed. And I say embargoed as opposed to secret. Why? Well, because the extraterrestrials pretty much do whatever they want. They come and they go. The awareness of extraterrestrials, awareness of the phenomena was slowly approaching worldwide penetration by the 1980s. So the government had a bit of a problem there. It had to keep denying the reality of something that was quite apparent to anybody that was paying attention. But they had special tools: misinformation, disinformation, ridicule, propaganda, coercion, and some influence on the media, and were able to keep the truth embargo together those 44 years. And the justification for it was not complicated. As it happened, the human race had finally achieved its ultimate goal, which is weapons that can blow up everything. We've been heading in that direction for 10,000 years. So we built atomic bombs. Not just a few, not just a few thousand. Ultimately, we had 75,000 nuclear weapons in stockpiles or on hair trigger alert. And as everyone knew from that period, one mistake, one screw up, and a nuclear war would take place that would ultimately destroy most of civilization. Not just the blast effects, but the nuclear winter that would follow, which would create mass starvation and kill billions of people. which is undesirable. So we lived under that Damocles sword for 44 years. And any attempt by anyone to, quote, somehow inject the extraterrestrial truth into that dynamic was going to go nowhere. And some people, I suspect, who decided to force the issue may have, how would you say, had bad endings. In any event, the Cold War ends in 1991, 1992, but basically by the end of 91. And President H.W. Bush could very well have disclosed the extraterrestrial presence, given that we were now in this new post-Cold War era. But he was embroiled in a war in Iraq. So it was not probably an ideal time to make a maneuver of that magnitude. But in his second term, though, it would have been perhaps totally appropriate. H.W. Bush was the darling of the military intelligence complex, a war hero, former CIA director, former vice president. He had a resume as thick as a phone book. Unfortunately, he lost the election to the opposite, the anti-George H.W. Bush, a pot-smoking, womanizing, unknown Bubba from Arkansas and his very ambitious wife. This was not met with much appreciation by the mainstream insiders in Washington and the military intelligence community, to be sure. So we are now in the post-Cold War era. The logic to continuing to lie about the reality of extraterrestrials, which most people consider to be a fairly big deal, was now changed, and the basis for the truth embargo significantly eroded. But the wrong president was in power. So when Rockefeller approached them to attempt to bring these files out, the effort that went on for 3 years had no chance of succeeding. And it didn't. So in 1996, the Rockefeller Initiative and that effort to bring these files out was closed down just before the next election, not surprisingly, where he would run for office again. And the Clinton team, which included certainly First Lady Clinton, Vice President Al Gore, Chief of Staff to the Clintons, Leon Panetta, Chief of Staff, Mac McLarty, a key advisor to the Clintons, George Stephanopoulos, close friend of the Clintons and Secretary of Energy, Bill Richardson, and a few others, all of whom had political ambitions, with the possibility of Mac McLarty, who kind of retired after that term. They all decided, we'll just never talk about this. We engaged the extraterrestrial issue. The media didn't cover it, because that's what the media doesn't do, particularly if it has a political context. We all have big plans, and so let's just pretend this never happened, and we will never talk about it. And thus began the connection between presidential candidate Secretary Clinton, when she started her campaign, which is late 2014. In America, we start our campaigns very early, like 2 years ahead of time, so they can cost $3, $4, $5, $6 billion, unlike many other countries. Why we do this, well, I leave that to historians to parse. And so this connection followed them down through history. And not surprisingly, given the power of the truth embargo, not a single question was asked by a mainstream reporter or television journalist or anybody else about this Rockefeller Initiative throughout that entire 23 years, starting in March of 1993. And they never spoke a word about it, period. Why? We'll get to that. However, they were introduced to the subject. They were introduced to two things. One was the subject, in a sense, without question. And the other was the constitutional breach that blocked them from access. I'll get back to the constitutional breach. But that's a big deal. You're the President of the United States, and now you have been directly confronted with this matter of whether there's an extraterrestrial presence, and probably tipped off, because it's easy to tip off a president to something. It doesn't mean you're going to give him a briefing, doesn't mean you're going to give him a tour of facilities. But just a little nudge. Bill, there are extraterrestrials. You'll never get any access to it, but you don't have a need to know. But there are extraterrestrials. And that's a big deal. It's the most significant issue in the world today. And the announcement of that extraterrestrial presence will be the most profound event in human history. That's some serious meat on the table for an ambitious politician. And certainly Bill Clinton was that. And so, in the back of their mind, this issue one day would be theirs. He was denied by his own government illegally, um, his own members of the executive branch, which he's the commander in chief of, access to this. And so, what happened is that the Clinton team started leaving breadcrumbs as to that connection for future both reference and use. And the first breadcrumb occurred on October the 22nd of 2002, when Clinton's chief of staff and former top advisor, during the Rockefeller Initiative, went into the National Press Club and at a press briefing there stated that it was time to open up all the UFO files. This clip, the key 15 seconds or 25 seconds of this, is now legendary and up on YouTube, and millions of people have seen it. He then repeated the same call for the release of the UFO files in 2003, again at the National Press Club, October 23rd. He then participated in a book around 2010 by Leslie Kean, again referring to this fact that maybe it's time to get this out in the open, and in a documentary that was created related to that book. And so we move forward toward the election, but again, never had they had to speak to the issue in full form or really speak the truth about the connection they had to the issue and the efforts that were made in 93, 96. But they had a problem. And the problem came from the work of Grant Cameron. That's a Canadian researcher out of Winnipeg who had been studying the presidents and the connection to the issue. And he was driving down in his Cadillac from Winnipeg and going to various presidential libraries and what have you, gathering information for a website called Presidential UFO. And as part of this work, he submitted a broad spectrum Freedom of Information Act request to the Clinton Office of Science and Technology Policy, which at the time was exempt from the Presidential Records Act, meaning it was open to FOIA inquiry. And somebody working, I guess you could say, with the records, kind of goofed and sent him 1,000 pages. And so in late 2000, into his hands come 1,000 pages of documents confirming the whole Rockefeller Initiative and the effort to get Bill Clinton, President Clinton, to release all the files backed by a billionaire Rockefeller. Naturally, that needed to get out. Grant Cameron, who was a colleague of mine, sent me a full set, which I still have. I delivered a copy of that to the Washington Post and to the USA paper, who had USA newspaper, and they had no interest whatsoever in that. No story there. So we put them up on the internet. Grant had some, and I had a selected, a substantial section of the documents up on ParadigmResearchGroup.org, and then proceeded to shove those links under the nose of any reporter that we encountered. And yet still they did nothing. They had the documents right there, right? The documents confirming Hillary Clinton's direct involvement. And so history continued on. The press awareness of it slowly rising. Hillary Clinton, of course, ran and was successfully a senator from New York. Pretty important position. Never came up in her campaign. Again, nothing said. And then she ran for president in 2008. Again, didn't come up. I brought it up, mentioned it on Fox News in 2007, in July, at the 60th anniversary of Roswell. But it went nowhere. Even though I did mention Rockefeller Initiative, no follow-up, nothing from any of the rest of the media. And so 6 more years go by. But the awareness of this issue grew with each passing year. And then a milestone event took place in 2013, which is the platform for what came next. And that is that thanks to a deal that was struck with a Canadian supporter, about ultimately $900,000 was made available to a partnership of which PRG was a part to create the Citizen Hearing on Disclosure, an unprecedented event in which 42 witnesses, about a third were researchers in the extraterrestrial phenomena field, and 2/3 were witnesses. And in this field, we have witness means something very specific. Military agency, political individuals, mostly retired, some still working, who have connection to and information about the ET issue in the context of their work. They're not whistleblowers because the truth embargo on the ET issue is not illegal, but they are significant, and many of them are quite substantial people. And this hearing was held at the National Press Club, this mock congressional hearing, National Press Club, May 2013. 42 witnesses testified before 6 former members of Congress, and it was all filmed in high definition, which set the stage for the political initiative of 2014, which was launched on November the 5th, when the entire set of the 30 hours of testimony was sent to each member of Congress. And it included 3 hours of testimony on the Rockefeller Initiative, the connection of Secretary Clinton and her husband, she who was running for president for the second time, and the extraterrestrial issue, writ bold for 3 hours. The Clintons knew this was happening, and they knew that it posed a significant problem for them. Because it was my belief, and still is, that she was going to claim the legacy her husband was denied in 1993 to 96 and be the disclosure president. Make the announcement to the world's people that we're not alone and there's ETs here, and put that on our mantelpiece, along with, of course, being the first woman president in American history. Though it would have been about the 70th female head of state worldwide, but the U.S. eventually gets around to things like that in time, which have been extraordinary, an accomplishment, without question. The problem is that she still had 2 years to the election. And the issue of the Rockefeller Initiative had caught up with her. Why? Because the Citizen Hearing on Disclosure provided a hook for Paradigm Research Group to get to the media. Hundreds of reporters were provided access to view all of that testimony. Of course, it was webcast live when it took place at the National Press Club, April 3 to May 5, 2013. So it was in play in a way it never had been. And as a result, the media showed up. What can I say? And the first articles appeared in Washington Times in November, December, and then more articles started appearing. And so the cat was out of the bag, right? What to do? Well, if only articles were being written, they might have just ignored them. But they had a much bigger problem, because reporters were now sufficiently engaged in this subject matter that they were contacting Secretary Clinton at her campaign headquarters and contacting her campaign chairman, John Podesta, who again was the chief of staff to Clinton and advisor to Clinton during the Rockefeller Initiative, of course, completely aware of it, wanting to know what's going on with this Rockefeller Initiative thing. And of course, they could not answer those questions, because if they did, the issue would have exploded ahead of their schedule. And so they stonewalled them all. And what I mean by that, they don't respond at all. Now, if you're a reporter and you contact a public figure with their comment on a story you're going to write, they come back with no comment, fine. If they come back with, it's all bollocks, it's not true, fine. If they come back and say, well, it's true, but let me clarify, fine. When they don't come back at all, you know you've got something going there. You know there's a story here. And so it just means you're going to get back at them again. And so with that kind of pressure coming down, what the Clintons were forced to do under the strategy of John Podesta was execute a tightrope walk that would hopefully allow her to cross from that period, right around January of 2015, to the election win of November 2016. And what was the tightrope that they were walking? It was this. we can't simply go fully transparent on this and talk about the Rockefeller Initiative, what went on, why we did it, why my husband was stonewalled, our thoughts on the ET issue, why John Podesta was calling for the release of files, et cetera, et cetera. If they did that, it would create a huge story, which would have heated up to the point that you get a critical mass, and we get what is commonly called in the United States a media frenzy. I've seen a couple of those. They're rather remarkable. Probably the most notable one would be the media frenzy surrounding the Monica Lewinsky scandal. You had to have been there to really appreciate it. But imagine herds of reporters roaming around Washington like giant herds of buffalo over the plains of Iowa or Kansas in the 1800s. Hundreds of trucks, white trucks with satellite dishes on top, all parked in long rows in front of this courthouse or this venue, trying to catch a glimpse of Monica. Because it was a sex scandal, and everybody knows that's what's really important. That kind of frenzy could happen. And so they couldn't do that. On the other hand, if they kept refusing to say anything, finally the pressure would build up, and they would have reporters so in their face, big-time reporters, top journalists, that they would have been in a very impossible situation. And of course, the longer they stonewalled, the more impossible the situation would be. Meaning, oh, you're talking now, but why did you talk last month or the month before that? You are running for president, aren't you? And so they decided to do this. They would make public statements in relatively controlled situations, most of which were not actually correct. They were misleading, but yet spoke to the issue. Thus dropping these breadcrumbs that would keep the press relatively comfortable with the fact, well, we are responding. I'm not going to give you a sit-down interview, but I said this, I said that. And from February of 2015 up to June the 2nd of 2016, a period of approximately about 16 months, the Clinton campaign on 12 occasions spoke to the extraterrestrial issue, or the quote UFO issue. It's not about UFOs. Wow. One of the controlled environments they selected for these breadcrumbs was the Jimmy Kimmel Show, an entertainment show run by a very funny fellow. And if you're a president of the United States or a former president or a candidate for the president of the United States and you want to be in Jimmy Kimmel, all you do is call them up and say, Jimmy, I want to be on your show. And they go, fine, what day? When would you like to be on? Fine, okay, we'll do it that day. And by the way, why don't you ask us about this? And so it came to pass that Bill Clinton appeared on the Jimmy Kimmel Show and was asked about the extraterrestrial issue. And then Hillary Clinton appeared on the Jimmy Kimmel Show and was asked about the extraterrestrial issue, the same question. Barack Obama, who was part of the Clinton team, please understand that, appeared on the Jimmy Kimmel Show and was asked the same question. Then he appeared on Colbert and was asked the ET question. She gave an interview to a small paper, not a big paper, the Conway Daily Sun, December 31st, 2015, and volunteered input that she would investigate the UFO issue if she was elected, and so forth and so forth. And there was the Ellen DeGeneres Show. And then Podesta spoke at KLA's TV, and he spoke to the Code Conference, and he spoke to Politico. Little breadcrumbs. Unprecedented. And all of these were being driven by PRG's work with the media. Right? After 20 years, I finally got it right. By the time that they stopped talking on June the 2nd, maybe a bit later, PRG, meaning myself, was in a working source relationship with 37 reporters, including 2 Pulitzer Prize winners. Working source means, no, you don't have their email, and once in a while you send them a link or something and say, please look at this. No, you are in regular contact with them. You are sending them regular information, and they're writing stories. How many stories were written about the extraterrestrial connection to presidential candidate Secretary Hillary Clinton between November of 2014 and the end of the campaign? Over 400. And these stories, unlike print journalism of, say, the 1960s and 50s, all had their internet article companion So the story might be in print, say in Mother Jones Magazine, but it's also on Mother Jones' website. And in the internet article version, you've got links to video clips and the Rockefeller documents and all of this stuff, all kinds of substantive material. 400 plus, hundreds more in foreign language press. The issue was receiving more political coverage in that period than in the previous 68 years combined, in the middle of the most intense and expensive, almost most expensive, political campaign in history. We were moving towards disclosure at a very rapid pace. The goal of PRG was for the media to finally put so much pressure on it that they had to break. Take the interview, sit down, get into it, create a media frenzy that would ultimately present itself to the Pentagon and to the White House with a lot of questions that they just had hoped to never have to answer, thus forcing a temporary closing of the constitutional breach that's been in place since the 1960s, in which the Pentagon and the White House would then come to an understanding that, okay, I need to tell the American people the truth finally, but I need your backing. I need some support. I need you to know that I need to know that you're going to be there. And the Pentagon going, well, fine, Mr. President, but if you're going to do this, we have certain concerns about how it might go down, the post-disclosure policies and what have you, all national security based, you understand. And then they reach an understanding and the president goes in and makes the announcement. And it would have been President Obama. The goal was to get it done under Obama, because there was no guarantee that Secretary Clinton would win, and if she won, there's no guarantee that she might not change her mind. So that by the time that the debates begin, we are in a very favorable position. And they'd been walking this tightrope, buffeted by winds through all that period. 2015, first 6 months of 16, could fall off at any time. And falling off would mean being forced to engage the ET issue and let it all out. But they got a break. And it's really disgraceful. And I've talked about this in hardened language, which may get harder still. In America, the debates for the person that's going to be the leader of the free world and control the most powerful nuclear force in the free world, all these debates are run by a presidential debate commission that sets the rules and protocols. And all of the debates are moderated by television news hosts, with a couple of modest exceptions, virtually none. These are the news hosts of news shows on the 6 news, basically, networks in America. NBC, ABC, CBS, CNN, MSNBC, and Fox. And what some people don't know, but I know and have published, is that hardly without an exception, every one of these news hosts are multi-millionaires. If you want to go be a war correspondent in Iraq and dodge bullets and IEDs to try to bring the people some truth about what's happening in a war, you might get a nice $80,000. But if you want to sit and read news on a news show, they will pay you anywhere between $1 and $20 million a year. And it is these multimillionaires that had, according to the networks and the commission, full control over what questions would be asked. So whether it was George Stephanopoulos or Chris Wallace, Megyn Kelly, there's so many I could list, but they selected the questions. There were 36 presidential debates and what we'll call forums, where the candidate would sit down with someone and give direct interviews. 36. There was roughly 28 candidates between the Democrats and Republicans that began the debate derby. That's a lot of candidates, a lot of questions, a lot of forums. And in all of that multi-month period, not a single one of these multi-millionaire news hosts asked a single candidate related to the Clinton extraterrestrial connection, even though it had been written up hundreds of times in English language press, including the New York Times, New York Daily News, Times of London, Boston Globe, Chicago Tribune, Washington Post, Washington Times, Vanity Fair, New Republic, and I can go on and on and on. Not a single question. And the reason for that is the print media is under less control in the United States than the network news operations. The three network operations are under FCC control, and so they have to be careful. The three cable news operations have such small audiences that they're constantly afraid they're going to do something and lose some audience. And so they frequently just will not challenge areas they consider to be too controversial. And so, quite simply, the question was never asked of her or anybody else. But it's not the only area, the only significant, vitally important issue to the welfare of the American people that doesn't get discussed in these elections, which are increasingly becoming as ludicrous as they are grotesquely expensive. And this election was the most ludicrous in American history, I have to believe. But still, the news story was fully in play. But having successfully navigated the debates, on June the 2nd, they made their last comment on the ET issue and then went completely silent. Nothing from anybody in the Clinton campaign. They were pretty confident, and so were the pollsters, that she was going to win the election. And then, once she won the election, of course, there was a whole lot of reporters that were going to be on her case immediately. Okay, now let's talk to us about this ET statements you were making and John Podesta was making and your husband. And why did it keep coming up, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But of course, they could not respond in full or appropriately or truthfully to those questions, because if they did, the media frenzy that PRG has been trying to negotiate for so long would have resulted in President Obama being the disclosure president, which would, of course, not been what they wanted. But they only had 77 days. So when you're the president-elect, you can deflect. You can say, well, I can't really get into that now, but after I'm in the White House, whatever. And then once she's in the White House, she's home free. And that deal, then it's just a few statements from her as president would have more than launched enough media frenzy to force the Pentagon to the table, and the world would have finally gotten the truth of the extraterrestrial presence. But she ran a bad campaign. She made many mistakes. And in August of 2014, in a presentation that I gave in Canada, and it's on tape, and I'm going to get that out eventually, I actually predicted that she would lose the election unless she engaged the extraterrestrial issue. I put out repeatedly an open letter to her, which I stated that engaging this issue and telling the truth on it would be exactly what was needed to blunt her fundamental flaws of mendacity and inauthenticity. Probably, I'm sure she read them, right? They've been tracking me for a long time. I'm not on their Christmas list, I can assure you. I get no cards, no invites. But, and she didn't. And in fact, they did a number of things that played right into these chief flaws of inauthenticity and mendacity. And on election night, I was in a Irish pub in Los Angeles where some people said, let's gather for a little election night viewing. A filmmaker that I knew hadn't seen me in a long time. We were going to catch up. And so I said, what the hell, I went down there. There was no food, but they had beer. I don't drink much, and someone bought me a beer. And so I drank that. And then my filmmaker friend showed up with a few other people, and he said, I need to chat with them for a while, and you and I are going to talk. And I said, fine. Meanwhile, of course, the election night coverage is going on and a television above the bar. I was halfway through the second beer when, perhaps a little ahead of the curve, but I do have a lot of experience following political developments in the United States, I realized that Donald Trump was going to be the next president of the United States. Secretary Clinton was going to lose, and that 4 years of work and being that close to ending the 70-year truth embargo was going to go up in smoke. And I began to become upset. Years of frustration and disgust, which is easy to come by in U.S. politics for some time now, started to well up in me, and I began to act out. So I removed myself from the bar right away before I made a fool of myself, and went home and began a mourning process that continued for several months. History is like that. History is what it is, and the best laid plans of mice and men often go agley, right? It's happened before. In 2001, Stephen Greer and the Disclosure Project had a very significant event also at the National Press Club, in the same room that I held the citizen hearing on disclosure, and put the witness testimony in play in a way it never had been before. And there was movement within the media, and things were looking very optimistic. 4 months later, the flying circus came to town, and planes started crashing into buildings, and that was the end of that. And the disclosure movement took another major hit. History can be that way. Well, it struck again. And for me, it was tragedy because I understand better than most what's at stake here, what not disclosing the ET presence can mean. And also I'm aware of the dysfunctions that are spreading and metastasizing throughout the U.S. government, as well as other nations, that is bringing us towards a rather, perhaps, unfortunate outcome. And so for me, it was a tragic loss. Because if you look through history, there have been many times when a single event has changed things and taken things into a really dark place.